Guys ready? Start with our work session. We on, David? Okay. Welcome to the December 20th, 2010 special called work session. Work sessions are a more informal setting to update the council on business items. No votes will be taken on work session items. Tonight there's one item on the agenda. Public comment is allowed that is germane to an agenda item. If you wish to speak, you are required to fill out a public comment card and turn it in to the city clerk staff. Public comment will be allowed for a total of 10 minutes per agenda item and no more than 2 minutes per person. Public comment will be heard at the beginning of each item. Once the item is called, no other public cards will be accepted. Will the city clerk please say on the agenda item?
Discussion of proposed text amendments, RZ 10-06, to amend the City of Milton zoning ordinance, Section 64-1820, landscaping business, plant nursery, or garden center with indoor retail component, and RZ 10-08, to amend the City of Milton zoning ordinance, Section 64-1, definition for landscaping business. Ms. Lynn Tully.
I'm going to ask Robin to go ahead and give this presentation.
Good evening, Council and Mayor. Just want to go over these two text amendments. They're married together because they're basically the same item in the discussion. The Planning Commission began work on the existing use permit for landscaping businesses, plant nursery or garden center with indoor retail components, Section 64-1820. In 2009, prompted in part by the increasing number of applications for landscape businesses within the city. This proposed text amendment is a result of several meetings in 2009 and more recently where the Planning Commission deliberated on the revised use permit and definition for a landscape business. Within the memo is the existing use permit and definition for a landscape business, which is more comprehensive in scope as it relates to balancing the proposed use with adjacent residential and agricultural uses. That is, the new proposed one would be more comprehensive than what is existing at this point in time. And staff notes that the proposed use permit does not include a plant nursery based on the fact that it is already permitted under the AG1 agricultural district, and it was determined that there should be no retail component associated with a landscape business. A plant nursery is currently permitted to sell the products raised on their property as dictated by the AG1 agricultural district. The Planning Commission had many discussions as far as the scope. There was even discussions of should a landscape business be altogether deleted from the agricultural district. It was their conclusion that they wanted to keep the the landscaping business use permit in agricultural, but to beef up the development standards to help protect the adjacent agricultural and or residential uses to that use. And what you have before you is the proposed wording of it, as well as a revised definition, and they deleted the sections as I referred to earlier, and they beefed up the meaning, which I'll go ahead and read to you. It means a business that provides services and locations away from the landscape business operator's property. While most of the actual landscape activity occurs off-site, the business owner's property may be approved for equipment storage, parking, material storage, and a building or buildings for storage and plant propagation. Landscape businesses typically include activities as lawn installation, mowing and maintenance, fertilization and or insecticide treatment, the planting and maintenance of trees, shrubs, and flowers, trees and stump removal, spreading and grading of topsoil, mulch, or other ground covers, the installation of stone, brick, and block walkways and stone walls, and the temporary storage of plant trimmings. So obviously this is much expanded from the original definition. After the Planning Commission meeting, we had our city attorney make a review of both the newly developed land use permit as well as the definition. You also have those comments in your packet for this work session. And so if you have any further questions or comments, you can ask myself or the city attorney.
Do I have any questions for Robin? Bill?
Yes. Robin, in the city attorney's commentary on the definition of landscape business, item number 4, comment there is item 4 is already covered by the overlay district standard, and therefore item 5 is unnecessary. So,
I'll go ahead and answer that. After further evaluation, that item that includes the 75-foot from adjoining residential district or AG1, that is not the same as that's basically a development standard and is not included in the overlay district. There is a 75-foot buffer for parcels of 4 acres or more, but parcels 4 and under would only be required a 50-foot buffer. But what I am proposing and what the Planning Commission agreed upon was to have a larger setback. Currently it's 50 feet of those items, and now we're increasing it to 75 feet, so you're even increasing the setback. Whether it's 3 acres or 10 acres, it's still going to be a 75-foot setback, but not a buffer. A buffer would be still dependent on the Northwest Overlay District of this parcel size.
okay, in that setback, pardon me, are we including any screening of parking areas, walkways, storage areas, dumpsters, or other structures?
I believe that, let's see, that we did speak about having them, further on the new number 4. It says, or the new number 5, it says personal vehicles shall be parked in approved designated locations. Vehicles and equipment used for the landscape business shall be garaged or screened such that they cannot be viewed from adjacent properties or the public right-of-way, and shall be parked or stored on specifically identified portions of the property. Also, already knowing that already should be a 50-foot or 75-foot visual buffer that's required by the overlay district. So hopefully, unless they get a variance and it's in lieu of the variance, they're still going to have to screen the parking and the equipment, either putting the equipment and the cars in a building or outside screened with plant materials or a fence.
Does the equipment cover dumpsters?
We would want the dumpster to be in the least, visual impacted area. I can't guarantee that from the front that you may be able to see the dumpster, but it also should it be screened with a 3-sided screening with a gate that closes, just like any other commercial dumpster.
Not specifically a vegetative screening, is that right?
Not currently, no.
So how are the other aspects being screened? The parking, vehicle storage, and the building?
It could either be through vegetation or additional landscaping, possibly fencing, so whatever would create that visual buffer, aside from the buffer that's already required adjacent to the property line. Because you're still going to be required that either 50 or 75-foot buffer in the Northwest Overlay.
So you're proposing a change from 50 feet to 75 feet?
For a setback.
For setback?
Not, yeah. So it's like 2 different layers. You have the buffer, the undisturbed buffer, it's a visual buffer of plantings. And let's say for a 3-acre parcel, that would only require a 50-foot buffer on all the property lines adjacent to AG1. But my setback, or your setback, would be 75 feet, so you're getting the equipment and all those items additional 25 feet away from the property line, interior to the property line.
So which version are we looking at here? It appears what's in our package is what we've gotten here on the table tonight. Is that
Correct. And I've made another set with that change that I just spoke about, of going ahead and keeping the new number 4 intact. And I have this here, so I didn't know if you want it now or if you want it for the next meeting, since this is a work session. But this would encompass, if you were to approve it tonight, I have the wording here.
After having gone through both of these ordinance here, maybe it's just me, but they're kind of confusing, I guess.
Well, there's definitely, it's a more comprehensive list of development standards, whereas the old one was very succinct and certain bullets, but it was the opinion of the Planning Commission to be a little more thorough and to discuss it. So it's just different from the existing use permit. And staff believes that with the changes recommended by the city attorney and all that, I think it would be appropriate.
Okay, further in item number 9, in the storage.
Okay. It includes some vagaries in here. In the first sentence, storage of landscape materials on the property may be permitted in limited quantities. Yes, I have an issue with limited quantities. Is that 10 cubic feet or is it 10,000 cubic yards? Who determines what a limited quantity is?
Which one is that, Bill?
Number 9.
Item number 9.
Okay, thank you.
Would that have to, because it says they have to be in a container, would that have to be shown as part of the use permit then? Or
Correct. It
whatever
would be in the-
is
it would be
approved
on
on
the
the use
site plan.
permit would be the amount that would be limited?
Correct. It would be, I mean, the storage area or the bins should be shown on the site plan that's submitted, and it would be relative to the size of the acreage of the property. So,
In what proportions? I guess this is where I'm
Right.
having a problem with it, is defining.
How do we define
Yeah.
the exact, is it X percent of the total property area, or?
right, it's a little subjective.
Yeah, and that one in particular, we did talk about it, specifically with the Planning Commission. We mentioned, limited is kind of in the eye of the beholder. What they felt like was, however, requiring those items to be contained, it would be the containment feature that would limit. So as long as you can contain it, you can limit it to, a smaller amount. I mean, if for instance, the containers encroached into the 75-foot setback, then obviously that wouldn't be allowed. So that kind of helps reduce the overall amount that you're going to get on any one site. Now, I'm sure someone could push the envelope, but we're trying to cover the 5 to 95 percentile here.
And we would, I guess, when we approved a use permit, it would show the size of the containers at that time, and you could limit it, we could limit it as a council at the time the use permit was approved to a certain size container, depending on what we felt like was appropriate for that size.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense to you, Bill?
It's still
Understood.
subjective, and it's at the discretion, I guess, of the plan reviewers and ultimately the planning commission.
Yeah. And council.
Further in this same article, it somewhat addresses area and size of the containment area, but it does not address height, any height limit. You could have maybe 1,000 square foot area there that might be 50, 60 feet high.
If it were completely contained, that might be a possibility. But there again, completely containing it, and then how do you fill something that's 50 or 60 feet high on four sides all the way up? So,
Well,
I mean, yeah, well, exactly. So,
and I think that, what you see in a lot of these storage areas is they build revetments, what they call revetments. They may be 4 to 6 feet high, but they're peaked up, and depending on the footprint of them, they may grow to 30, 40 feet high, and adjacent to a residential area, they're quite obtrusive. So, and I can cite a few of them, up and down the road here. How would you address that then?
I don't think we really talked about
Other
that
than
much.
having, in the zoning ordinance, walls are only permitted up to a certain height, then we could refer to that it could not be any higher than what a permitted wall is allowed in height, which I believe is a fence or wall is like 9 foot. It's either 9 or 11 feet, the maximum.
I think what Bill's saying, though, you might have to include, if you limit the height of the walls, you'd have to limit the height of the storage of the material, because if I'm reading what Bill's saying,
Yeah,
if
they
it's a
would
large area, they could pile the material up much higher than the walls.
Further on article or paragraph 10, all landscape debris and other refuse shall be contained in appropriate size containers. How do you identify appropriate? Or how do you define appropriate?
That's, I think much of that is driven by the size of the operation, because what we've found with some of the landscape businesses is that they'll have a small container, but they do a lot of business, and it ends up overflowing. So I think it would be to the discretion of, maybe the community development staff determining what would be appropriate as far as, even if afterwards, if it doesn't work out, if they don't have enough times that they empty the container, then they're going to have a larger container or more containers to be able to contain all the debris.
This is really specific to your commercial dumpsters.
Right.
And if they're constantly overflowing, then code enforcement's going to be out there all the time saying, you got to get this cleaned up, or you have to get a larger container, or empty it more often. I mean, there are a variety of options for them to take care of it, so we're trying to leave them the opportunity to take care of it, but then also let them know that, overflowing is not going to be appropriate.
Well, I know the limitations on our manpower out there, and we try to stay as lean and mean as we can. Who actually monitors this, and where's the enforcement aspect of these different items?
Typically, it would be code enforcement. Obviously, if we respond to any complaints, if there are some issues out there, those get moved higher on the priority list. But yeah, they would routinely just kind of go around like they do now and try to proactively find some of these issues if there are any issues out there, and then responding to complaints. A lot of 99% of what we get is complaint driven.
And to Councilmember Luss' point, if that's a concern and concern with the rest of the council, would it be reasonable to say, you had a limit on the height of the container, and then a formula, a reasonable formula for the storage of the materials, maybe that's 1.25 or 1.4 times the height of the wall. That way you could enforce it, and it would, I don't know exactly what that number is. My guess would be somewhere between 1.25 and 1.5 times the height of the wall. If it's a 10-foot wall, maybe allow them to pile it up 15 feet, but that's it. But
I think the planning commission's intent was really that you wouldn't see it beyond
Okay.
the wall, but
Okay.
I don't know that I can verify that unless one of our planning commissioners would like to get up there and talk about it. But
And I can just interject that I double-checked with the code. The highest fence is 8 feet. So that might be a possibility that
just be confined within that 8 feet.
the height, yes.
Well, going back to the original comment there, if you have an area that's 8 feet by 8 feet, are you going to allow them to go only 8 feet high? But if you have an area that's 100 feet by 100 feet and you have an 8-foot wall, are they only allowed to go 8 feet high? I guess the intent of having a larger area is the fact that you can mound it higher. So going to John's comment here, are you going to allow them to go up on a slope of 1.5 to 1 or just 8 feet high? And I'm belaboring this because I know of certain cases out there where there are mounds out there that are 30, 40 feet high next to residential areas.
And so, yeah, and that's one of those things we would have to amend in the text. I mean, that's not currently proposed, so if that's something that you want.
And you're,
we can do that.
Robin, you said you believe the Plan Commission's intent was to not see the material at all
I
within
believe
the...
that's the case, but Mr. Ragsdale's here if you'd like to ask him.
All right. Yeah, in fact, I'd, welcome any comments from Planning Commission members. If they had on that, if they wanted to speak on that at all.
I think Bill hit the nail on the head. I mean, the issue is enforcement. What you guys are proposing is adding criteria that would increase the things that have to be enforced. And right now, we're not enforcing just people conducting business, much less how big their pile is. Don't forget that there's a requirement that everything be screened, so that I'm not sure why we care how big the pile is if it's not visible. The other thing is the size of the facility is going to be, in some respects, dependent on the size of the property of the owner that's coming forward. We don't know how big a landscape business is going to be. We don't know how big the applicant's property is going to be. From a planning commission standpoint, Bill asked a question about which of the two ordinances in front of you you should be looking at. We don't support the change that was recommended by the city attorney with respect to item 1 being redundant with item 3. They are intentionally talking about two different things. Item 3 is talking about the size of the buildings that may be associated with a landscape business. Item 1 is intending to talk about the size of the landscape business itself. The city attorney proposed the word intensity in one of his changes. I think we would be willing to change scope to intensity as a way of talking about the size or the intensity of the business. But item 1 was intended to speak to how large the overall business is as opposed to the size of the buildings, which is what number 3 was.
Okay. Anyone else have a question for Planning Commission while Mr. Ragsdale's here? Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Bill.
Sorry to take up this time. Item 14, access shall only be allowed from arterial or collector streets. I asked Carter earlier today if we have a list, a specific list of arterial or collector streets. And the definition apparently varies with a different type of use. I understand that. I think somewhere in here, and I failed to mark it, but they're saying that access may not be from local streets. So if you would kind of explain that to me, what's that type of access from a local street? If they can't access it from a local street, are they left with an aerial access?
No, actually, it's a functional
Or subterranean?
classification. So we're talking about the size and type of street. Local streets are typically your subdivision streets, a few of your local roadways that aren't really used for collectors or as major east-west or north-south arteries. And Carter has probably got a traffic count definition for that from a traffic engineering standpoint. From a zoning standpoint, the definition is based on the type of street and type of traffic that it serves, not necessarily the number of cars. So arterials and collectors are defined by the type of traffic that they serve. And again, like I say, we're not talking about a subdivision street. The intent here was to limit the location of these landscape businesses to areas where the roadways would really support it, where they wouldn't be affecting neighborhoods necessarily, things of that nature. So that was the intent behind that requirement. And again, we would look to Carter for support if there was a question on whether a street was a local street or an arterial or collector. We'd use our zoning definition, but we'd also look for the other definitions that we use routinely in the city, either in the CTP or that GDOT might use for that same definition.
I'm wondering if we couldn't incorporate that explanation or that definition into the ordinance.
Well, we already have a definition in the zoning ordinance, and like I said, it's just, unfortunately, it's a little bit more general than maybe we would like it to be, because of the fact that, like I said, it defines it by type of street, or type of traffic that it serves, and not necessarily by a traffic number, traffic count, and it doesn't provide a list. We could maybe reference a listing of streets by functional classification that may exist in the CTP. I'm looking at Carter here to see if we have a list in there by classification that we could reference. We could do it that way if you all would prefer it. Sorry, Carter. Which ones?
Well, the CTP does have a functional classification map in it. It's got one that is recommended by GDOT. It's got one that the CTP actually evaluated those roads and made some modifications to. And it's got a third functional classification map as one that we basically inherited from the GIS system. So they all tend to vary slightly in their numbers. And from our standpoint, there's a vehicle count per day on some of those roads. So up to 4,000 vehicles a day, between 4,000 and 10,000 vehicles a day that you can put on that. Whether or not you want to put that in this particular type of ordinance to limit it to those roads, well, that's a good question. I mean, the characteristics on a local road, from the standpoint that they may be residential, are very similar to the characteristics that you're going to see on the arterials and collectors here in Milton. So, aside from increased traffic on the bigger roads.
So ultimately, then, in practically, who determines whether or not it's a local road? Is it the applicant or is it community development?
Under the zoning ordinance, it would be community development.
Okay.
Okay. I have some other questions for staff on this. What I'd like to do, too, if we can try to ask your questions, but if we can try to squeeze it in as quick as we can, and then we're obviously going to come back to this during our meeting, and if everybody collects their thoughts and questions and whatnot, we'll continue discussing it. But we've got, it is 6 o'clock now, which is the start of our regular meeting, and we've got several people here for other items. So I believe, Alec, do you have a question?
Okay, do we have a, thank you, Mayor, do we have a final recommended version inclusive of Ken's comments?
Yes.
Or would that just be the marked up, the red version?
I have another. This is.
Okay. My second question, I guess I just want to back it all the way up to the beginning. I understand this is a recommendation from the Planning Commission. I guess I want to back it up from the very beginning, and I want to ask you straight out. Given that we have denied landscaping businesses for doing this very same thing previously, I guess I'm wondering what's driving this change.
Okay.
Because we have denied businesses for doing this on AG1 land before. We've even gone to court and you know, brought legal action against the business doing this very same thing. So I'm wondering why we want to change our ordinance to allow this now.
Well, this is something that it started more than a year ago. And it is something that was prompted by the fact that we were getting more and more requests for these kind of use permits. How they were coming about, whether they were existing businesses that just came to light as being used in this way, or whether there are new businesses that were being requested for a new landscaping company that started. I don't know if both weren't the case, and probably some other situations as well, but having seen several of them at the same time, the Planning Commission decided they felt like, you know, they really needed to take action. They felt like they needed to clean up what was allowed there to make it a little bit more understandable as to what type of business we were talking about, and the limitations specifically for that business, because they felt like there was probably some creep that was going on as far as the type of business activity that was occurring on site, and, you know, again, kind of some of the adjunct facilities and adjunct uses that would follow on with that.
Because I do have some concerns that it seems like we're getting away from the spirit of the special use permit as it was intended for AG1 land. It seems to be getting more and more business-like, in my opinion. The second question I have is, number 2. I know that there was some differences of opinion between the Planning Commission and the attorney regarding the number 1 and number 3, and whether number 1 and number 3 were contradictory. And I do understand Mr. Ragsdale's point with number 1 in wanting number 1 to speak I guess specifically to the intensity of the landscaping business. So I guess if we took the recommendation going forward, it would be something to the effect of the intensity of the landscape business shall be appropriate to the size of the property and its neighboring uses. And then number 3 would be retained, and it would speak to the size of the building. I have problems with number 1, if that is what we go forward with. And the reason I have problems with number 1 being intensity shall be appropriate to the size of the property and its neighboring uses. We've had problems in the past trying to deny businesses that otherwise meet our design standards with regard to buffers and setbacks. Yet we know good and well that the use is too intense for that property, but yet we can't. I mean, it's almost like we're trying to build in a subjective criteria in number 1 that we're not even going to be able to ever enforce. Number 6, with regard to the maximum of 6 employee vehicles, would this be personal vehicles or would this be commercial vehicles? Because I'm trying to figure out where the ordinance speaks to the number of commercial vehicles that would be limited.
It doesn't speak to the number of commercial vehicles. This does specifically talk about the employee vehicles. So these are the vehicles that they bring in, you know, when they drive to work and drop off and take the company vehicle off-site.
Okay. So then if we were to accept this, even though this is AG1, there would be no limitation on the number of commercial vehicles that could be on the property as long as those commercial vehicles are shielded.
Screened, yes.
Screened. Okay.
We could limit that, though, as part of the use permit, correct?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, because, I mean, that, to me, the number of commercial vehicles kind of speaks to intensity of use, which, again, is an issue for me on AG1 land. And then my last comment, Mayor, has to do with number 9 versus number 12. The last sentence on number 9 says, limited quantities of fertilizer or insecticide may be stored, provided they are in the manufacturer's original sealed containers and placed inside the building, blah, blah, blah. Councilmember Luss spoke to that earlier. And then number 12 is the on-site bulk storage of gasoline, diesel fuel, and other petroleum products, fertilizers, and insecticides is prohibited. So again, I take us back to the subjectivity of that. What is the difference between limited quantities and on-site bulk storage? Because, you know, what might be on-site bulk storage to me may be limited quantities to somebody else. So I would need more guidance and more clarification in the ordinance itself to be able to.
That may be something where we tighten up with, you know, in, like, this is manufactured, you know, containers or whatever, and not just a big, where they bring in and dump
I think
fertilizer.
that was the intent, yes.
Other things and fuel. They, you know, they may have to tweak it a little bit for fuel too. They may have some small containers that, you know, fuel for their Bobcat or whatever, that kind of stuff. So, Bill?
One other comment on Article 6. The fourth sentence starts, vehicles and equipment used for the landscape business shall be garaged or screened, etc. That doesn't include dumpsters.
That would be in the overlay district.
Okay.
Okay. Again, if we could just kind of wrap this up, we have some other questions, and then again, I will certainly give everybody their time to think about these questions, and then when we get to this in our meeting, we'll discuss it fully.
I was going to say, this comes up in our meeting
Correct.
next, so I'll just save my questions
Okay. All
until
right.
then.
I guess I have a question. When we first talked about this being postponed from our work session of last week, I think the direct question that Chris was asked of you was that, depending on what questions came out of the work session, whether or not there was going to be ample time between 5:30 to 6, and then 6 to our meeting to address the plethora of questions that I've already heard, and we haven't even all asked our questions. So before we necessarily presume that this goes on to the agenda next, I'd like, Chris, for you to be able to speak to what was spoken to several weeks ago when we first moved this to a work session.
That's why I got this microphone close, because I was getting ready to do that. Okay, number one, y'all don't get any more weeks off. I guess I've got a couple of different thoughts. One is, obviously we're sitting here tonight upon a meeting that's going to happen in the next couple of minutes, and obviously there still seems to be a bunch of questions that need to be answered. If we were really sitting here in a work session, I guess one of the questions, which maybe I'll ask now and then I'll kind of give you maybe what my thoughts are and how we move forward with this. One of the questions I would ask with this being presented to you in a work session is, obviously there's been some planning commission work, there's been some staff work on these items. Are these definitions that currently exist in our code that you all even want to think about modifying? If the answer to that question is no, this becomes real simple. If the answer to that question is yes, I'd be willing to entertain looking at it and hearing the recommendation of the Planning Commission with staff's interjection and Ken's interjection. Then my recommendation is going to be, you're right, there hasn't been sufficient time. These are the kinds of discussion we would have had last week. We would have had a whole week to answer some of the questions and come forward tonight with a presentation. If this is something that you want to pursue further, I see that there is no harm done in allowing this. It's not like we have a whole bunch of these in the pipeline that we have to make a decision on tonight. I see no harm to recommend. Obviously, it's on the zoning agenda, I believe, tonight, which means we're going to have to sound the item and we're going to have to hear public comment. But I don't see any reason why there would be any harm to move this to the zoning agenda in January to provide additional time to answer some questions, if you even want to look at this as something to be amended in the code.
That would be the question I would have. Is the staff's opinion, would there be any concern if we did postpone this and spend some more time in a work session? That way staff would have even some of the questions that have been asked tonight, we could address a little bit more. Have the planning commission involved too. Is there any concern that staff has that, is there any trigger that this has to be done in a certain, critical time period or?
No, I don't. I just conferred with Glenn. I don't see one. And as we're always cautious when we're making laws. I mean, and we don't want to take that lightly either. That, if you were to take action on something tonight, it in effect becomes the law as soon as you take that action. So. We would certainly don't want to just do that in a knee-jerk reaction in the spirit of getting done with it. If it requires some additional thought, we'll certainly open to that.
Why don't we do this, and if this is all right, legally, Mr. City Attorney, continue on with begin our meeting, and when we get to this point, we can discuss it, and if the council and staff feels that it would make sense to defer this or reschedule it, maybe we'll go from there.
Can I ask one
Karen?
quick question? When is the planning commission meeting again? Would they be able to have time to review the attorney's changes prior to our next zoning agenda? Because it sounded like that they weren't comfortable with quite all of the changes.
Next planning commission would be January the 25th.
That's after our next.
I believe it is.
Let's go over this.
Yeah, we can go into February.
We'll figure it out during the meeting, but I'll have a date prepared for you.
Okay. Yeah, be thinking about this, and when we get to this point in the meeting, we can.
And just as a point of order, because it's a work session, I know that we ended up having these back-to-back, but would we normally have asked for input on this item? I just want to make sure before we bring conclusion to this meeting that we've done everything we needed to since we moved it. That's just a
Was there
question.
any comments?
I don't know. I just.
There's a public comment in opposition, and I was saving it for the zoning agenda for the regular meeting, unless we want to.
Again, I'm just asking because we have both meetings together.
Yeah.
As long as it's read once, we're fine.
Okay. We all have it. Okay. All right. I'm going to adjourn this meeting, and that way we can start our regular meeting not too late and move forward. So I want to thank everybody that's here tonight. We're excited to have you here, and got some presentations. But before we start, I'd like to welcome Dr. Oliver Wagner, Senior Pastor with Alpharetta